I'm Shannon Kerrigan and I'm Manager of Equity and Diversity at La Trobe University.
And I'm Jo Rubinicht, Senior Disability Advisor at La Trobe University.
And we're going to have a conversation today about an approach that we're taking to working with our students, which comes from a social work frameworks, a strength-based solution focused practice. And we particularly think it's relevant in tertiary education working with students with a disability because they have many challenges, but they have to rise up to many of the challenges themselves, and we have a crucial role to play in encouraging and supporting them. We still provide plenty of supports for students, but a lot of the support is about how we encourage and support people to overcome challenges that they have. So it's a bit like a mind map that you work in practice. It's not a road map that you go from A to B to C. You think about these stages in a process of having conversations, and you might weave from the end to the beginning again and back and forward. But basically the steps are that we work with students to get a vision of where they're going, and it might be as simple a question as what course are you in, and what are you hoping to do when you finish, where are you going, what do you want to do, what sort of practice in that particular area might you be particularly passionate about. So that's a great start because you're finding where people really want to be, and you often see them lighten up and lift, and you'd know that very well, Jo.
Yeah.
And then we work at looking at the problem that they've got presenting, and we then work through some questions around, how has the problem presented itself, when has the problem occurred in the past, and has there been times when they've been able to resolve that themselves. And that gives us what we call exceptions, or opportunities where we can pull out or pull apart more of the details about how a student has been able to bring their own strengths and other resources that they have to solve a problem. And then we look at what other resources we could bring to that problem as well. But the core of it is having strength-based conversation. So it's asking questions and recognising when people are giving you information about their circumstances and how they've resolved it. So probably a good way to go about this is for Jo to talk to us about a student she worked with recently where Jo used this practice to great effect.
Okay, so I was fresh from training in strength-based work, and I had a student come in who was very, very concerned about how she was going to manage a forthcoming field placement for her degree. And she was feeling very overwhelmed, and her question to me was, what can you do to make this easier for me? And I thought, I'm not sure that that's really going to be the path we need to go down. So she first unpacked, what were the requirements that she was presented with, and she told me how many hours of placement she had to do, and she also told me that there was flexibility in that. She had a certain number of weeks in which to complete those hours, which meant she didn't essentially have to be doing it full time. There was also flexibility in terms of submission of assessment tasks if she negotiated that ahead of time. So her fears were that she was highly anxious and very easily overwhelmed, and was really worried about how she was going to manage on placement. So we had a bit of a discussion first about, where did she see herself going with this degree? And ultimately she told me she was planning to go on to higher education and eventually to a field of professional practice. So that was a very clear pathway that she'd established, and she was quite, feeling very positive about her capacity to actually get there and be that person. So that was a really good starting block in the first place.
And isn't that often the case when you ask people where they're going and what their vision is, they animate and, and they get excited.
I think it kind of takes them out of their current situation of dealing with the study process. It brings them to, their life goal. So we then sort of looked at the fact that she'd been successful in her academic studies to date, and also she told me that she'd had to have an interview process as part of this, getting towards the practicum. So she'd already met with her supervisor, she'd been for an interview, and I asked her, well, how did you cope with the interview? You're telling me you're very anxious, and how did you get through that process? And she just said, well, I have the capacity to act confident even when I'm not feeling that way. So I thought, well, that was a terrific strength to start with. So then we really sort of unpacked, well, what are your personal strengths? What's led you to be able to achieve academically? And what do you think the strengths might be that you would bring to this field of work, and particularly on placement? And she gave me a list of some very good pointers, like being highly organised, determined, flexible, and compassionate and respectful of others. So that was a pretty good starting block, and she acknowledged, that there's some really good things that she had to bring.
And can I just interrupt you? That's one of the strengths approaches too, that we ask people what their strengths are that they would bring to a situation. We might recognise a strength, but we would ask them if they think that's a strength, rather than telling them what their strengths are.
Yeah.
So they get to articulate it rather than yourself, which is a much more empowering approach, because we can easily influence people with our points of view if we're going to be telling people what's good and what's not and what they're good at. They need to realise those things themselves. So,
And then I asked her, well, what are your real concerns here? And she said, I might become easily overwhelmed, I might become upset and tearful. But she'd already told me that in the interview process she'd had discussion with the supervisor. The supervisor had she'd talked about those fears already with her supervisor, and the supervisor had outlined that there were supports in place within the field of practice that she was going to be working for staff, because it was recognised that they may be dealing with overwhelming situations. So I was able to just reframe that fear of hers into another strength, her own strength to advocate, to recognise firstly her concerns and to advocate for them, with her supervisor. And throughout this conversation, I had a teary, highly anxious student come into the room. And I could see throughout the process her starting to sit back, the tears stopping, her looking much more relaxed, and she ended up saying to me, I feel so much better about this. We had other discussions in there as well about how she might structure her working week, what might be the benefits or otherwise of having rest days and when a rest day might be appropriate and so on. She had scope to make those decisions herself, though acknowledging that would have to be done in consultation with her supervisor and the demands of the workplace, that it wasn't just open slather, that there were things that had to be factored in there, but she had a place to go and make those discussions. So she ended up leaving the room with a much more relaxed and confident demeanour and feeling like she could probably tackle this.
And instead of you being the one to solve her problem, she's actually in that process solved her own problem. As far as we know, she's feeling more confident about herself, and she'll be able to take that practice into her future study and her professional career, no doubt.
Well, I did ask her too, before we got to the very end, I said, do you think there's anything we need to sort of document or put in a learning access plan or anything for you to provide to academics? Is there anything extra really that I can be adding to what you've already achieved here? Or what strengths you already have? And she said, no, I don't think so.
No. Fantastic. So we've shared the power, we've tapped into her aspirations, we've got her to articulate her strengths. that we've been able to look at what other resources she might need. Now, in this situation, she didn't need anything else. In another situation, you might actually have to provide something, depending on the circumstances and what the student really needs. But in the end, it's about her choice, it's empowering, and that was a perfect example. And you were only just straight out of training while doing that. Well, acknowledging the years of practice that you've already had to build on, but it seems like a very good outcome.
I found it a really great process to work with, and it certainly boosted my confidence in using that and seeing where it might be appropriate in the future.
Okay,
thank you.